Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Out and About. We're at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance. Let's go see what Cindy has for us today.
Welcome everyone to the Western Museum of Flight. I'm Cindy Mach, the director. I promised you one of the foremost experts on the realm of supersonic flight, so it's time for me to make good on my promise. Mach is a respected historian, artist, and published author. He brings a specialty interest area from his portfolio to us today. And he's also the new curator of the Museum of Flying at Santa Monica. Welcome, Mach.
Good morning. Thank you, Cindy, for the very nice introduction. Always a pleasure to be here at the Western Museum of Flight and see all the wonderful enthusiasts this morning, and thank you very much for attending. As you see on the screen, we're going to be talking about the X-planes and the golden age of flight test. Cindy actually had a better title, Mach Busters. Now, I'm going to say the beginning of a sentence, and you're going to finish it for me. Are you ready? Here we go. I feel the need for speed. Right. Very good. We're going to have a good time today. Why did airplanes have to go faster all the time? Well, that's what we're going to talk about. A number of reasons. To get places faster, to escape an enemy aircraft faster, to approach a target faster, and on a humanitarian level, to get people to wherever they had to go faster. And it all comes down to flight test research and taking those very first steps. That's what we're going to talk about. Before we do, let's get some terminology straight. Subsonic, less than the speed of sound. Commercial airliners today are flying at subsonic speeds, as they've been doing since the late 1950s. There's a reason why it's never been faster, with a few exceptions. We'll talk about that. Transonic is that realm where a jet airplane in the late 40s could go into a dive, just touch on supersonic speed and come back. And so that's the region where you could make supersonic speed, but it wasn't designed for that. Supersonic, Mach 1. What does Mach mean, other than the first four letters of Cindy and my last name? That is Ernst Mach, who was an Austrian physicist who was studying shockwave propagation and discovered, almost by accident, the speed of sound, which is 760 miles per hour-ish. And I say that because that's a relative value. People ask me that all the time. What's Mach 1? I say, where? It's affected by altitude and temperature, adiabatic lapse rate, any number of factors, but it's roughly 760 miles per hour at sea level, and then it lessens as you go higher, so it'll be about 650 at 35,000 feet. Hypersonic is anything above Mach 5, so that's about 3,500 miles per hour. And last but not least, orbital velocity. Why are we talking about that? You'll see at the end of the program, but 17,500 miles an hour is technically the fastest that any winged aircraft has ever been flown, and we'll talk about that. Okay, let's start at the beginning. A blistering 38.7 miles per hour was the first official world speed record. And I don't mean to make light of that, but let's talk about the Wright brothers for a few minutes. They were the world's first test pilots. Everything they did was for the first time. And I always go back to that very first series of flights at Kitty Hawk on December 17th, 1903. They made 4 flights with the original flyer. It was then lost in an accident due to wind. Kind of rolled up in a ball. It was rebuilt, lost again in a flood in Dayton, had a very short life, but those 4 flights were probably among the most significant ever made because it got the whole thing started. So let's talk about first world records. First world distance record, 120 feet. First altitude record, 14 feet. First speed record, around 35 miles per hour. And from those humble beginnings, we have the airplanes that we have today with the amazing performance and reliability and safety. By World War I, just a mere 10 or 12 years later after the Wright brothers first flew, we had airplanes that were not only capable of 100 miles an hour, but were flying aerobatics, basically, in combat. The first biplanes. Here we have Eddie Rickenbacker, the 94th Squadron with his famous SPAD. A decade later, we had the Schneider Cup racers. Now you're in the 200 to 300 mile per hour range. Jimmy Doolittle here with the Curtiss racer. A decade later, you were in 300 to 400 miles an hour. Just a meteoric advancement of technology. Here we have the Republic XP-41, which is the predecessor to the P-47 Thunderbolt. And by World War II, we were firmly in the 400 to 500 mile range with some stellar aircraft such as the P-51 Mustang, Vought, F-4U Corsair, Grumman Hellcat, and so on. So we're now reaching some serious performance with airplanes that are just not even 5 decades after the Wright brothers first flew. And then we get to the jets. Now, raise your hand. How many here have heard the term the blowtorch era? You guys familiar with that? I see some of the pioneers are familiar with that. The very first jet engines, when they lit off, looked like the flame out of a blowtorch. That's where the term came from. But it referred to the very first airplanes that were propelled in flight without a radial engine of some sort or a piston engine of some sort. And so the blowtorch era was the very beginning of jet age as we know it today. And these were airplanes that were sub or transonic at the 600 mile an hour speed range. Now we get to 650, first airplane ever to fly 650 miles an hour, the Douglas D558-1 Skystreak. We see it here with two gentlemen on the lake bed at Edwards. The fellow on the right is Gene May, referred to as the flying grandfather because he was flying jets at the age of, 55, 60 years old. Oh my gosh. And then to his left is Marine Colonel Marion Carl. Now when we get to the 650 mark, something happens. The air in front of the airplane builds up faster than the airplane can penetrate through it, and the popular name for that phenomenon was the sound barrier. Airplanes could not penetrate through this wall of air. If you think of the bow wave of a boat building up in front of the boat, and it just can only go so fast. That's basically what was happening. So we have a family of X-planes that we see here at all different shapes and sizes and different manners of getting to the same place, which was supersonic speed or very high performance. Starting from the lower left, the silver airplane there is the straight wing is the Bell X-1A. We have the straight wing Skystreak, as you saw before, the Delta Wing XF-92, which led to a whole family of Delta Wing Convair aircraft. The Bell X-5, which was a variable geometry wing based on German technology captured at the end of World War II. The swept wing Douglas Skyrocket, first airplane to Mach 2, we'll talk about that. The Northrop X-4 tailless airplane, essentially a jet flying wing, and in the center, the X-3 Stiletto. This is an airplane that really changed the game. This is the Bell X-1, shaped like a .50 caliber bullet, developed by the Bell Aircraft Company at a time when they knew it would never be in production. It was strictly a research airplane. And this is a great tribute to the founder of the company, Larry Bell, where he would commit to the company resources to something like this, a one-of-a-kind program that would only benefit technology and never go into production and make a lot of money for the company. This gentleman is the fellow who flew it into the history books. As this photo was taken, 24-year-old Chuck Yeager, World War II ace, brilliant pilot. Extra credit, anybody know the shadow? Whose shadow is on the X-1? That's his best friend, Jack Ridley, who was a flight test engineer, and he and Chuck made a very formidable team to conquer the sonic barrier. I'm going to show you the cockpits of the X-planes as we go forward. This is the X-1. The Mach meter is up there just to the right of center, and it goes to 1.0. So the famous phrase, the Mach meter went plumb off the scale, that's what he's referring to, is that it only went to Mach 1. Not that they weren't optimistic. But here's the iconic Bell promotion photo, and I want to talk about this for a second. The caption at the bottom says, the Bell X-1 at supersonic speed. Now think about this. This is the only airplane in the world that can fly supersonic. Who took the picture? This is actually a photograph taken on an earlier powered flight, and the gentleman who took that photo from a FP-80 shooting star with a camera nose was none other than R.A. Bob Hoover, First Lieutenant, U.S. Air Force. He was an Air Force pilot before he went to North America, and obviously had a tremendous history in World War II. We know all those stories. But Bob Hoover was a chase pilot for Chuck Yeager on that program. So let's go back to the photo. One of the little touches that I really love on the left wing, just outboard of the star, is a streak that you see there, and that's the oil from the B-29 number 2 engine dripping on the airplane. So it proves that it was carried aloft in a piston-powered bomber. But here we have one of the rocket chambers of the XLR-11 engine firing, and Hoover explained to me that he took this photo as Yeager literally launched from the B-29 and went flying past his airplane. He saw him coming in the rearview mirrors and just clicked the shutter at that exact moment, and this is probably one of the most famous photos in aviation history. Here we have the cover of the LA Times, but the date is December of 1947. Why did it take so long? The fact that Yeager had gone supersonic was a highly classified secret. The DOD did not want it known that we had the capability to fly supersonic because we were at the very beginning of the Cold War, and we didn't want our adversaries to have knowledge of the fact that we had this kind of performance. But somehow it leaked out, and by December, Aviation Week had published it, and it was in the major press. And there's a rendering of what they thought the airplane looked like. Not too bad. Here's Chuck and Bob 50 years later to the day. On October 14th, 1997, these two gentlemen reenacted the supersonic flight at exactly 10:45 in the morning over Edwards, just as they had done 50 years before. Yeager was flying an F-15 named Glamorous Glennis II, and Hoover was chasing him in an F-16 piloted by none other than Jimmy Doolittle III. So there was a lot of aviation history in the air that morning. That same year, I was honored to be commissioned by General Yeager to paint what became the commemorative image of the supersonic flight. And this was dictated to me by General Yeager in vivid detail. We were at 7,000 feet on a heading of 101, 10:45 in the morning, a downwind leg to lakebed runway 17. Which in those days wasn't marked out the way it is on the lakebed today. They have all these lines and directions and compass rose. In those days, it was just one stripe, and flight test engineer Jack Ridley parked a Jeep on the lakebed so Yeager had something to aim at. Primitive by today's standards, but boy, they got it done. So again, he was describing this scene in vivid detail, and he wanted Hoover in the FP-80 at his 8 o'clock low position. That was very specific, 8 o'clock low position. So I do these paintings by building models and setting up a diorama. And it happened to be mid-October of 96 at that point. And it was 10:45 in the morning, and I was in the San Fernando Valley, which is the same general area as Edwards. And so I was getting all the atmospherics, and I had the models set up, and there was this shadow over the front half of the P-80. And I'm going, well, that can't be right. And I'm changing the models and moving them around. I couldn't get rid of that shadow. It's in the painting. The painting is entitled, "Hey Pard, You'll Get a Free Steak at Poncho's Tonight." If you're familiar with the litho business, titles tend to be short and punchy, right? Free steak, hey Pard, Mach 1, X1, no. General Yeager said the title would be, "Hey Pard, You'll Get a Free Steak at Poncho's Tonight." What that was an encrypted message from Hoover over the radio to the whole world that Yeager had gone supersonic. Now think about this. Poncho Barnes, if you're familiar, had the Happy Bottom Riding Club up there, a watering hole for the test pilots, a legendary gal, a former air racer, movie stunt pilot, just an amazing, legendary persona. And she was very aware of the fact that the commercial test pilots were being paid, the company test pilots were being paid bonuses and large amounts of money to kind of hang it out there and do these first flights and these dangerous missions and so on. While the military pilots were making $75 a month or whatever the pay was at that time, paltry rate, doing literally the same type of flying. So to honor the military pilots, she said she'd give a free steak dinner to the first military pilot to go supersonic. "Hey Pard, you'll get a free steak at Poncho's tonight." And everybody on the frequency knew he had done it. So that's the reason for the title. So we made lithographs of this, signed by both General Yeager and Bob Hoover. We had the debut of the print and the painting and a big symposium up at the Museum of Flight in Seattle, Washington, the Boeing Museum of Flight. And they had the painting on an easel. It was all lit. It was against curtains. And I had flown up there with Bob Hoover together, and he walked into the room and he sees this painting and he goes, "That's exactly right. How did you know to put the P-80 in that position? I always flew in Chuck's shadow to keep the sun out of my eyes." And then he paused and he said, "And I've been in Chuck's shadow ever since." But art imitating life. And so, again, with great, immense respect for General Yeager and Bob Hoover for that event that day, it was really an honor to paint that. And this is hanging in General Yeager's home as we speak. The other thing, too, the world record quest for fastest and highest and everything, there was a tremendous rivalry, not only in the inter-service arena. You had the Army and the Navy battling it out. You also had Great Britain, France, and eventually Russia, all coming into the game with their own airplanes trying to push the barriers higher. And so the first British airplane to go supersonic was the de Havilland DH-108 Swallow, a flying wing. Unfortunately, they built 3 of them. All 3 crashed and killed all 3 test pilots. But it did advance British aviation, and it was a time period when those things happened. I'll touch on that for a second. They didn't have in those days the reliability, the escape systems. They just didn't have the technology. And so the price was paid in lives and machines to learn what worked and what did not work. And it took some very courageous people to make that all happen. So I say that with great reverence. Here's the first jet-powered airplane to achieve supersonic flight in level flight without going into a dive. Republic XF-91 Thunderceptor with the inverse tapered wing. It did not go into production. It was part of a series of airplanes that were developed to be high-speed, high-performance interceptors at the beginning of the Cold War. But I will tell you, as a Republic guy, this was a huge step toward the F-105. This was the beginning of the advanced systems and real high-performance airplanes. Two were built. One was lost in a ground fire, and the other one is at the Air Force Museum at Wright-Patt Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. So now we're above 700 miles an hour. We got the F-86D Dog Saber, and we're in 1952. And here's an interesting time period. First supersonic flight was 47. Let's go back to that Wright brothers flight in 1903. By this time period, we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the Wright brothers flight, 1953. And there suddenly was a push to get as many records in the book as possible. There was a quest toward Mach 2 with rocket-powered airplanes. And so now you're getting into kind of an intense battle again. We're going to see a few of these throughout history. For those who flew supersonic, they would get a Mach Busters Club certificate. In this case, it was an F-86 Sabre issued by North American Aviation. And that made it official. So now we're into 53, and here we go with a whole bunch of records that were changing hands almost monthly. It was an amazing time period. Here you had the British Hawker Hunter at 727 miles an hour. And then the Navy took that record with the F-4D Skyray. This is a painting by the great R.G. Smith showing the record run at Salton Sea, summer of 53. Now you're at 752. And then the Air Force took the record back with Pete Everest and the YF-100 Super Sabre prototype, 755 miles an hour. And then we get to the quest for Mach 2, and this is where it really gets interesting, because now we're getting close to the anniversary date. There was going to be a huge Air Force Association dinner. It was going to be a big deal. It was in all the media, and December 17th was looming on the horizon. And this Douglas Skyrocket, which we see here in the original form, it was a jet-powered airplane. There were three built. The first was a jet, second was a hybrid jet rocket, and the third was an all-rocket to be air-launched. Here we see the first airplane taking off the lake bed at Edwards with JATO. And this is the man who flew this airplane into the record books, Albert Scott Crossfield. For those of you who purchased my book, you have read the stories. I was so privileged to have worked with these gentlemen. And Scott was just really in a class by himself, a very, very wonderful, wonderful man. And so on November 20th, 1953, getting close to that anniversary dinner, he air-launched from a Navy version of a Boeing B-29 and took off into history with the first flight to Mach 2. He reached 2.05 that morning. And as he told me, two interesting things about the flight. He had a head cold. Try wearing a pressure suit going to 70, 80,000 feet with a head cold. And he flew without gloves. And he said the reason was that the airplane was, they had cold soaked the fuel, they had taped all the gaps, they had waxed it. It was the max effort. It was everything this airplane had to reach Mach 2, and he wanted to feel the sensitivity of the controls through the stick. He didn't want to wear gloves. And he said his hands froze to the stick at altitude. So here's my painting of that event, and he named it. It's called Everything She's Got. And it refers to the fact this is the absolute max performance of the airplane, Mach 2.05. Here's proof of the no gloves. He finally got back on the lake bed and warmed up and handed his knee pads to Walt Williams there, the NASA personnel. But guess what? Right on his heels, Chuck Yeager in the X-1A, a more powerful, more advanced version of the original X-1. Chuck took it out to Mach 2.44. Let me take a moment here. You know how pilots always have titles? First pilot to do this, last pilot to do that, youngest guy, oldest guy, whatever it was. There's always these titles. Well, in this rivalry between Yeager and Crossfield, Crossfield became the first pilot to fly Mach 2, and Yeager became the first pilot to fly faster than Mach 2 in the X-1A. But an interesting thing happened on this flight, and again, it talks about, it addresses the fact that these airplanes were taken to the absolute limits of their performance envelopes. Yeager got to 2.44. He was up in the mid 70,000 feet, 73, 74,000 feet regime, and ran out of control authority. And the airplane flipped over on its back and went into what they call inertia coupling, which is a series of three-dimensional tumbles at very high rate of speed. His helmet in negative G cracked the canopy. Thankfully, it held. He was wearing a pressure suit, but it was a violent, violent ride until the airplane tumbled down into thicker air. Now, here's where it gets interesting. He was approximately over Tehachapi, California, and the airplane went into a flat inverted spin, which sounds pretty formidable, except he knew how to get out of that. So he put it into he righted the airplane and recovered from the spin, and got the airplane stable at 23,000 feet over Tehachapi. I don't know if you're familiar with how far Tehachapi is from Edwards, but I fly sailplanes up there. And every time I'm over that spot, I think of this flight because I've gotten to 13.5, maybe 14,000 in the glider, and I'm literally under where Yeager came tumbling down. And I look over to Edwards, and it's way the heck out toward the east. And I'm thinking, all right, let's see. I have a glide ratio of 36 to 1 in my sailplane. And the glide ratio, what's a glide ratio? It's the number of feet forward for every foot that you lose in altitude. That's called L over D, lift over drag. So I'm at 13,000 over Tehachapi in an airplane that has a L over D of 36 to 1, and Yeager was at 10,000 feet higher with an airplane that had an L over D that was 1/3 of that. And he got to Edwards. And I remember asking him, I said, were you able to get it onto Rosamond, which is west of the base? He goes, hell no, I wouldn't want to walk back. I got it to Rogers. And I'm thinking, you got to be kidding me. So just a testament to his piloting ability and airmanship that he survived the tumble and regained control and got it back to Edwards in one piece. An amazing story. That was December 12th, 1953. And so when they got to the anniversary dinner for the Wright brothers' 50th year anniversary, it was Yeager who captured all the headlines, and rightly so. But that same year, we had an airplane up at Edwards that was just starting into its test program, and that was the Bell X-2. And we're going to come back to this in a little bit. The X-3, I'm going in numerical order of the X-planes. The X-3 is what I refer to lovingly as the best-looking, worst-flying X-plane ever built through no fault of its own. This was an airplane developed by Douglas to achieve supersonic speed without having to be dropped from a bomber. It could take off and land under its own power on the lake bed. It was designed for the Westinghouse J46 engine, which never came to be, and so they put J34s into it, which was a much less powerful engine, and it really, the performance suffered. But I always like to look on the bright side. It had a stub wing, which was later used by the F-104 and the X-15. It was the first airplane to use titanium structure, and most importantly to me, it was the first airplane to have an air-conditioned cockpit. The takeoff roll of the X-3 was 3 miles on the lake bed. Yeah, you heard that right. It was a new set of tires every flight. And again, through no fault of its own, it just did not have the performance that it was designed for. The gentleman you see pictured here is Douglas test pilot Bill Bridgman. An amazing guy. I only wish I got to meet him. But he was well loved by the test pilot community. He was an avid surfer. He was born and raised was brought up and raised in Malibu, California. And I remember talking to Pete Everest one time, and I said, did you ever know Bill Bridgman? He goes, oh, yeah. He was always swimming in the pool at the club. Always swimming at the pool at the club. But he was an avid sportsman, a former Navy pilot, and he was the last corporate test pilot, company test pilot, to set world records. That doesn't happen anymore today. But he went to Mach 1.8 in the skyrocket and almost 80,000 feet in the skyrocket. And so he got his name into the history books. Beautiful color shot of the X-3 on the lake bed. You see that hatch that's directly below. It had a downward facing ejection seat, which thankfully never had to be used. They only built one of them, and it made 59 flights total. It is also in the Air Force Museum, a miracle that it survived. It also was a victim of inertia coupling, flown by NASA pilot Joe Walker, who discovered that and tumbled down and then literally climbed back up and did it a few more times to get more data on the phenomenon. They built them differently in those days. They certainly did. Well, now we're at the 4-digit club, as I call it, the 1,000-mile-an-hour airplane. This is the English Ferry Delta II. Does it remind you of any other English airplane that came a little later, like maybe the Concorde? This is the very first step into that realm. The folks in Great Britain were rightly proud of their record and took out an ad to tout the airplane's accomplishment. And I'll read it to you. It says, in essence, faster than any airplane in the United States, beat the United States record by 30 miles an hour, on and on. 30%, I'm sorry. This ad appeared in Time magazine. So it was, again, a kind of a PR push to say who was the fastest and who had the most records. But now, in 1954, we have the rollout of an airplane that became the first jet-powered machine to go Mach 2. This is the F-104 Starfighter, missile with a man in it, as they called. Went supersonic went Mach 2 in 1956. And we had, in that same year, a Mach 2 bomber, the Convair B-58 Hustler. So now you can see we're really advancing into some serious performance in a very short period of time. And then we get to the summer of 1956, where this airplane came into its own, the amazingly beautiful Bell X-2. This was the quest for Mach 3. Now, we're talking numbers. I'm throwing numbers out. Let's think about Mach. How fast is Mach 3? Well, it's about 2,100 miles an hour. But how fast is that? Okay, here's something to think about. It's a Friday afternoon. It's 5 o'clock. You're stuck in your car on the 405, right? And you're stopped at an off-ramp, so you have the sign above you, right? And the next off-ramp is 1 mile ahead, okay? So think in your mind how far that would be looking through the windshield of your car. You're looking down about a mile. At Mach 3, you're going to cover that distance in 1.4 seconds. That's how fast Mach 3 is. The guy whose name is synonymous with the X-2 is, at that time, Lieutenant Colonel Pete Everest, Frank K. Pete Everest. And he was the chief test pilot at Edwards at this point. And here he is sitting on the lake bed, and you notice that the background is airbrushed out. This was a big thing back in those days. They were very sensitive about locations. They didn't want to show Edwards, and so the background was airbrushed out. But I want to call your attention to the logo. This is the iconic, as they call it, the drop shadow X-2 logo. And take a look at it. It was designed by Bell Aircraft, put on at the factory. There's just one little thing. I've talked about this in my presentations before. There's something that I call Machat's Law. Machat's Law says that no two airplanes look the same, no two airplanes are painted the same, and the only consistency in airplane markings is their inconsistency. So I'm going to show you how many, for the modelers out there, and anybody who's interested in these logos, take a look at how many there were. Here's the second logo on the second airplane, and then you have the square letters. And then you have the open square letters. Oh, by the way, you see the helmet that he's holding with the Indian war bonnet? The life support guys, as a gag, painted his helmet with that because he was the chief pilot. And all the chase pilots had one feather on the back. They were the Braves. True story. When I met Pete Everest at his home in Tucson, that helmet was up on top of the bookcase. And I walked in and went, "How are you?" Oh, my God, that's the helmet. But he had it in his living room. I thought that was pretty cool. And then the final logo, this is with test pilot Mel Apt, and this is the large square open drop shadow X-2 logo. But the point being, there were 7 total X-2 logo designs, and it even changed from side to side of the airplane. Here we have Pete Everest on the left, and on the right is movie star William Holden. This is an interesting moment. It's part of the reason I'm standing here before you today. William Holden starred in a movie in 1956 called Toward the Unknown. Anybody here seen Toward the Unknown? Oh, I love it. Okay. I was 9 years old. My mom took me and my best model building buddy to the theater in beautiful downtown Patchogue, New York. And I sat there and I called this movie the 90 Minutes That Changed My Life, because I was just sitting there in awe of these vistas of the California desert. Long Island didn't look like that, didn't have the same sunlight. And so watching these airplanes, in fact, I'll tell you something. The movie didn't really star William Holden, it starred the Bell X-2. That was really the star of the show. It was filmed at Edwards Air Force Base from January to March of 1956. It was released in September. And I later came to learn, as I studied more about it, that they actually edited in actual flight footage of the X-2 after they had finished filming up there to keep it current and get the most recent shots of the powered flights. Holden was a former military guy and was just very enamored with the story. This is legend. The base commander, General Stanley Holtner, was fascinated with Holden's Ferrari that he brought up to the base, and he said, "I'd like to make you a deal. What would it take for the general to drive that Ferrari down the Edwards runway 22 at 100 miles an hour?" And Holden said, "I want to fly supersonic in the F-86. And Holtner said, deal. So here's a trivia fact that you can amaze your friends with at cocktail parties. William Holden was the first Hollywood movie star to fly supersonic. All as part of that movie. But back to the X2, here we see it loaded into the, now it's an EB-50 mothership, more powerful version of the B-29. The X-1 was lowered down into a pit. The airplane, the B-29 taxied over the top. It was raised up. Here we have the opposite. The B-29 is raised up, or the B-50 is raised up, and the X-2 is rolled in underneath it. These elevators came out of the ground. They're still there. They're in the parking lot at South Base. It was the Northrop B-2 facility. Now it's used as a flight test research facility. But you can still see those yellow stripes that lead up to the elevators. I parked my car right on top of it just to say I did. But they're still there. Here's a beautiful color shot of the X-2 being taken to altitude. You see the LOX jettison being vented out there. It took this airplane to get it up to 35,000 feet and get it started on its record runs. Here's the cockpit of the X-2. Think back to the X-1, how simple that cockpit was. And here you've got a much more complicated panel, more systems, and a two-stage rocket engine, 5,000-pound upper barrel thrust, and 10,000-pound lower barrel. Here's my painting of the first powered flight of the X-2, November of 1955. Pete Everest is making a turn to the lake bed. There was a small fire that broke out in the tail, but that was easily repaired. But it was the first time in a 10-year program that the X-2 flew under its own power. I might call your attention to the lower right-hand part of this painting, which shows the what is now Edwards Air Force Base main base under construction. They were just pouring the concrete for the runways. The roads are laid out, but there are no buildings yet. And there's a little dot in the center of the Edwards runways. That's hangar 1205 being moved from South Base up to the main base. The two large hangars at the west end of the flight line were originally at South Base. It was cheaper for the Air Force to move them than to build new ones up there. But this is a very amazing time period, and there was still a rail line that bisected the lake bed, which eventually was taken out. The last two pilots to fly the X-2, standing on the ladder, Ivan Kinchlow, and in the cockpit, Mel Apt. And these are the pilots that took the X-2 to its limits of performance. On 10 September 1956, Kinchlow flew the airplane. First time an airplane had been above 100,000 feet. There were no ballistic controls on this. This is just a ballistic arc, an amazing amount of pilotage and airmanship to get this accomplished. And he wound up with the nickname First of the Spacemen. He was then selected to be the chief pilot for the X-15 program, which was just starting to come into development. And then 17 days later, Mel Apt took the airplane to Mach 3. Unfortunately, the airplane went into inertia coupling and was lost, as was the pilot. He tried to bail out using the escape capsule, which was the forward part of the airplane literally separating, and then the process was that it would be lowered down to a safer altitude. He would jettison the canopy and manually bail out over the side. He was unable to do that because of the G loads. But let's get back to the international rush. By 1958, we had a Mach 2 jet in France, the Griffon, and the prototype Mirage, which became probably the most successful French fighter ever built. And then the British had reached Mach 2 in the English Electric Lightning. The prototype version, this is a Mark 6, but the earlier versions went Mach 2 in 1958. And the Russians got on the map with a civilian version of the MiG-21 called the E-66 and the later development E-166. And they were in the Mach 2 club as well. Now we get to the X-15, which was a quantum leap from anything that came before. We had new technology in terms of designing airplanes and instrumentation and everything, and so we took the bar up quite a notch. But here we have Ivan Kinchlow on the left, looking at a rocket sled, testing the ejection seat, and I'll show you that in a second. And the gentleman on the right, anybody recognize who that is? That's Neil Armstrong, who, as Mill Thompson, X-15 pilot, said in his book, went on to do other things in the space program after he flew the X-15. But here we have the seat test off a rocket sled at the Edwards high-speed track, and they decided to go with seats and a pressure suit for escape from this airplane, regardless of the altitude and speed regime, based on the unfortunate episode with the X-2 capsule. They figured if the airplane could get low enough and the seat had enough stability, you see the wings that open up there, the pilot would have a higher survival rate than in a capsule if it malfunctioned. And so think about this, the SR-71, Mach 3.2, ejection seat airplane. So that's where that all happened. Now we get to the cockpit of the X-15. This is now we're looking at a very advanced airplane. This happened to be the third airplane. You can tell because the panel was gray and had a different instrument layout than the earlier ones. But what's interesting about this is it had 3 separate control sticks, three control systems. The center stick is for low speed, flying it just like an airplane, a regular airplane. The handle on the left is the RCS, reaction control system, which is a series of jet thrust at the nose and on the wings of the airplane that would steer the airplane when it was outside the atmosphere. And then on the right is a side stick that operates the regular control system, much like an F-16 today. The test airplane with the side stick, technically the first U.S. jet to be flown with a side stick, was the North American F-107, which tested the system for the X-15 and became the first side stick controlled airplane. Now, you remember Scott Crossfield and the Skyrocket? This fine test pilot and gentleman decided to leave NASA and dedicate his life and his career to the development of the X-15. And he went to North American and became the chief project pilot and chief engineer on the X-15 program. Here we see him in a Navy centrifuge wearing the Dave Clark pressure suit, testing the initial systems of the airplane in the centrifuge. This is Ship 3 under the wing of the B-52 mothership. Now we've advanced from the B-29, B-50, and the B-52. Here's a launch. This is an unusual painting in that it is Crossfield's last flight. He made 14 flights in the airplane. And I should mention that in between each flight, unlike the later flights in the program where they were flying it every 2 or 3 weeks, or flying one of the airplanes at least once a month, these early flights would be aborted before they got to the runway, after they took off. When they got to altitude, there were all these problems that had to be solved, and it was Crossfield who, as I say, dedicated his career to getting the airplane into phase 1 testing where it would be flying reliably. And then this is his last flight. But what's unique about this machine that we see in this image is it's got the XLR 99 engine, big 50,000-pound thrust engine, and a nose boom. It's an unusual combination. To my knowledge, there were only 3 flights made in this configuration. But for the X-15 mavens, they look at this and, you know, it looks incorrect, but it is actually correct. Here you see the standard configuration, the cue ball nose, which is a basketball-sized metal sphere that rotates, and that gives it the yaw data for the telemetry. So now we've talked about Mach 1, Mach 2, Mach 3. Here we are at Mach 4. The X-15 achieved that speed in its early testing, 1961. And then I have a picture of the first airplane to go Mach 5. And here's a picture of the first airplane to go Mach 6. And then we have the altitude flight. Here's a picture of the first airplane to go higher than 200,000 feet. And I'll bet you can't guess which airplane went higher than 300,000 feet. All in 18 months of testing. Think of the compression of how rapidly they achieved those milestones. And all of them were flown by this gentleman right here. At the time, was Major Robert M. Bob White, World War II pilot. He replaced Kinchlow. He was Kinchlow's best friend. And Kinchlow was lost in the crash of an F-104 in July of 1958. And Bob White stepped in to fill that spot. And he made all of those flights in a period of 18 months between 1961 and 1962. The later test pilots in the program, the X-15 flew from 1959 to 1968. It made 199 flights. And everybody says, why didn't they make 200? Made 199 flights. They were trying to make the 200th flight for weeks in winter in 1968. And they kept getting weathered out. They have marginal conditions. And program manager Paul Bickle decided he was not going to risk the airplane and risk any of the pilots' lives. And at the end of the runway, he scrubbed what was going to be the 200th flight because there was a snowstorm. And so the X-15 has 199 flights. But these pilots, from left, NASA pilot Jack McKay, Joe Walker, Milt Thompson, Air Force pilot Bob Rushworth, and Air Force pilot Joe Engle. And these were the gentlemen that took the X-15 all the way to its limits in its performance. And we see Ship 3 here on the lake bed. This is my painting of Joe Engle's astronaut wings flight. What's an astronaut wings flight? Technically, the definition of space by the FAI is 50 miles above the Earth's surface. That works out to 264,000 feet. On this day, June 29th, 1965, happened to be the day I graduated high school, by the way, Joe Engle took the X-15 to 280,000. And he was 32 years old at the time. He was the youngest pilot ever to fly the X-15, the youngest pilot to qualify for astronaut wings in this airplane. Here we see Joe on the lake bed. And you notice that on the airplane, the NASA logo has melted off. You remember the famous meatball with the orbit and the NASA? And that has melted off the airplane from the heat of reentry. So when we did the painting that was reproduced as lithographs, I got this panic call from the printer. And they said, "Mr. Machat, oh my gosh, there's something happened to your painting." I said, "What?" He said, "Well, there's a smudge on the front of the airplane. It's like somebody rubbed up against it." I said, "That's the way it's supposed to look." The logo had melted off. It's an accurate depiction. Made the guy's day. But there you see the front of the... this is the mothership salute. This is a surprise to a lot of folks. The average length of a flight of the X-15, which launched up near Ely, Nevada, and covered 500 miles back to Edwards. Average flight was 4 to 6 minutes, 5 or 6 minutes from launch to the landing. That's the kind of speed that thing had. The altitude flights were slightly longer because they went higher and took longer to come back. Altitude flights were 6 to 8 minutes. And then there's the famous flight of Neil Armstrong, 12 minutes, where how many people saw his biography, the movie, First Man? And there's that opening sequence where he's skipping out of the atmosphere and everything else. That's not exactly what happened, but he was handling a control system problem, and the airplane simply would not turn back to Edwards. And when he got it under control, he was approaching downtown Pasadena at 73,000 feet and got it back to Edwards. It was the longest flight in the program, 12 minutes, 15 seconds. But point being that the X-15 would be on the lake bed in 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes. The mothership took an hour to get back from the launch point. So generally it was Fitz Fulton, who was flying the B-52 quite a bit, Charlie Bach, any number of the launch pilots would come in over the lake bed and do a low pass over the X-15 as a salute to the rocket ship. Here we have Jack McKay, NASA pilot. 1 year to the day after Bob White went Mach 6, which was November 9th, 1961. November 9th, 1962, McKay had a problem. The engine would not develop full thrust. He made an emergency landing at Mud Lake. There was a series of lake beds that were on the path back to Edwards. Unfortunately, he couldn't lower the flaps. The airplane landed very heavy and very fast, collapsed one of the skids and rolled upside down. McKay was injured. He survived. He was requalified to fly in the X-15 again. Sadly, his injuries became insurmountable, and he passed away in his 50s. But this is the beginning of the next step in the X-15 story, which is the X-15A2. That airplane was rebuilt after the crash. It was lengthened to hold more fuel. They gave it external fuel tanks, and this is going to be the airplane to take the ultimate quest to see how fast this airplane could go. Why is it pink? Well, this is the beginning of ablative coating testing. The ablative coating made by Monsanto, it was the texture of a pencil eraser, a pink pencil eraser. And the famous story, test pilot Pete Knight, who flew the X-15A2, looked at this thing and he said, "There's no way I'm ever going to fly a blankety-blank pink airplane." And so it was white. Well, the white is a coating over the pink, but Pete likes to tell that story, and I'll share that with you. So you notice now the windshield is oval because they wanted to eliminate the corners. They were getting cracks in the plexiglass from heating, and so they eliminated the corners. But this is an interesting thing. This material would melt at temperature at high speed. So there's Pete Knight, and you see on the other side of the cockpit there's a little door that's open, and I'll show you what that is all about. This was the famous eyelid configuration. Now think about this. The ablative coating is melting over the windshield and making the pilot IFR. So Pete would fly the beginning of the flight looking out the right-hand side of the windshield. And then when it melted and was covered over, he would open the eyelid for landing and land out of the left side of the windshield. Here's my painting of, call it knighthood at Mach 6.7, which was the ultimate speed of the airplane, 4,250 miles an hour. And here is just jettisoned the external tanks. On the bottom of the lower fin is a dummy scramjet engine, which melted off the airplane. The heating was so severe when this thing landed, it was scorched. It never flew again. This is the airplane also at the Air Force Museum that's now been restored. As we get to the end of the story here, we have now a Mach 3 jet-powered airplane, the largest airplane ever to fly Mach 3, which is the XB-70. Here we have Air Force test pilots Joe Cotton on the left, Fitz Fulton on the right. These were the project pilots for this airplane. One of the most beautiful aircraft ever devised and ever flown. Here you see taking off out of Palmdale, California. 2 were built, 1 was lost in an accident. The surviving airplane, Ship 1, is at Air Force Museum as well. And then we get to this machine. Now we got a jet that can routinely fly at Mach 3.2. This is the YF-12 interceptor version of the Blackbird at Edwards, being this first public display in September of '65. And then we get to the ultimate Blackbird, the SR-71. I might have mentioned I was an Air Force artist for 25 years, and so I was assigned to cover a lot of interesting Air Force events. This was the takeoff at Palmdale of the record coast-to-coast flight, which they flew in 68 minutes from coast to coast. Now, it's not takeoff to landing, but they started over Ventura, they ended over Salisbury, Maryland, and the distance was covered between those 2 points in 68 minutes. The instructions were, don't do it under an hour. So I covered the takeoff at 4:30 in the morning out of Palmdale. You see fuel being jettisoned out of the center port there at the tail. It was an amazing flight, and they delivered the airplane to the National Air and Space Museum in Washington. And I remember asking the pilot, Ed Yielding, after the flight, and I met him, and I said, what would you consider was the most difficult part of the flight? What was the hardest part of the flight? And he looked at me and he said, well, the hardest part of the flight was getting on a United 767 and taking 5 hours to come home. And I'm going to close with this machine. This is the shuttle orbiter Enterprise, which never flew in space, but tested the landing performance parameters 5 times before the shuttle was committed to orbit. And this was flown by none other than X-15 pilot Joe Engle, who later made the second orbital flight. So these were a series of tests being launched off a 747, landing on the lake bed from 23,000 feet to the lake bed in 2 minutes, 15 seconds. And it was a series of 5 approach and landing tests. On the second flight of the Columbia, Joe Engle became the first and only person to manually fly a winged aircraft in space. On the re-entry, he flew portions of the re-entry profile from orbit to the lake bed to generate the data that would be used by the automatic system that was used in all the remaining shuttle flights. So he has the distinction of having flown a winged airplane at 32 years old and a winged airplane, winged aircraft in his late 50s, early 60s when he went into orbit with the Discovery. He was the youngest person to fly the X-15 and at the time the oldest person to fly the shuttle. But Joe has the distinction of piloting a winged aircraft in the atmosphere at 17,500 miles an hour. It's a picture of Joe and his co-pilot, Commander Dick Truly, on the lake bed after the landing, and it was quite a feat. So what happened to the need for speed? Here we've gotten all this amazing performance, and today we don't have to rely on supersonic capability the way we did before. What happened was stealth, first generation. This is the F-117 Nighthawk out of Lockheed, first generation stealth fighter, used in the Gulf War. Then we have second generation, the Northrop B-2 Spirit. These are my photos on Air Force chase missions as an Air Force artist. When you have an airplane that looks like this, you don't need it to go fast. It's invisible to enemy radar, invisible to adversaries. And so we are back to, are you ready? Subsonic performance, because you don't need to go fast with this kind of capability. And it all comes down to what we have today in the F-35 Lightning II. This is the X-35 proof of concept prototype that I chased on one of the test flights. And this is kind of the amalgam of everything we just talked about, all the technology leading to a digitally designed, digitally flown, this airplane does go supersonic, but a stealth fighter, which has all the capability of every airplane you just saw. I might mention a little play on words on the name. It's the Lightning II. Why is that? This was done in cooperation with the United Kingdom, Rolls-Royce, a lot of British BAE systems, a lot of co-mingled technology. So we have our Lightning I, and the Brits have their Lightning I. And so this airplane is the F-35 Lightning II. This is a mural I painted at the museum at Edwards, and this is 30 years of flight test in one glance from 1947 to 1977, showing all the flight test airplanes, motherships, chase airplanes over the base and the lake beds. I'll just close with this. Next time you're sitting on a 777-300ER, flying between any 2 cities in the world, having dinner and watching the movie, just remember it all came from these airplanes that made that possible. It's a salute to the technology. We would not be where we are today without these great airplanes. You've been a wonderful audience. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Appreciate that. believe we have some time for some questions. If we have, we can do some questions and answers if any of you have any questions you'd like to ask. The question basically is, where does the F-4 Phantom fit into the pantheon of aircraft that have achieved this kind of performance? And we'll spend a minute on that. The F-4 is really in a class by itself because it was developed as a Navy interceptor, fleet defense interceptor, and then expanded as a multi-role fighter. And it was the first twin-engine, two-man crew airplane because you needed the Gib, the guy in the back, Rio, whatever you wanted to say, RSO, to operate the systems and allow the pilot to concentrate on flying the airplane. So the F-4 Phantom represents the beginning of what is considered an aerial weapons system aircraft. And it could achieve Mach 2 performance. It was used in Vietnam, both by the Air Force, Navy, and Marines. And it was just an ultimate multi-role fighter. It was the first fighter to be built in the quantity of over 5,000, used by any number of nations. It was just an amazing airplane. Still one in the air today with the Collins Foundation. But awesome that you got to fly it at Mach 2, and thank you for the question. What are the white patches on the X-planes in my paintings? Thank you, I should have mentioned that. Those patterns, very distinctive patterns, are the result of the condensation from the liquid oxygen in the fuel tank as the airplane descends into the warmer lower atmosphere. And so you would see these triangular patterns because the airplane was descending and the fuel was sloshing around at the bottom of the tank, and it would make that little triangular white pattern. On the X-1, it was the entire forward part of the airplane. And thank you for asking, I should have mentioned this. On the X-1 at launch, it was an entire white band of LOX condensation. And then when it landed, whatever was left in the tank would condense and you get that weird pattern. And Yeager actually corrected my original pattern on the painting because he said at that point the fuel would have been here and it was supercooling the bulkhead by the nose gear door. I mean, he really had it down. But those white patterns are frost on the outside of the airplane as it re-enters the atmosphere and gets into warmer air. Thank you for the question. The question was Ivan Kinchlow and his last flight in the F-104. He was tasked with taking a 104 from Edwards to Palmdale for some maintenance, and he took off on runway 22 at Edwards and lost the engine halfway between Edwards and Palmdale. Low altitude. The F-104 at that time had a downward firing ejection seat, which was really great at high altitude, not so great near the ground. And so he tried to roll the airplane and eject upward and was just running out of energy. And sadly, both the seat and the airplane went in together, and he was lost in the accident. It was July 1958, a tragic loss to the flight test community. His name will live on. He achieved so much in the X-2, and he would have been the prime Air Force X-15 pilot. And it was just a very, very unfortunate part of flight test at that time. Thank you for the question. Appreciate it. The question was, what about the accident where Crossfield landed on Rosamond Dry Lake? The airplane bent. They called it the world's fastest plow at that point. Scotty, God bless him, the things that these test pilots faced on a daily basis were just Herculean in terms of the workload. And on that particular flight, he had an engine fire right after launch and was unable to jettison the propellants, and he landed very heavy. And what happened was Scotty would land at a fairly high angle of attack, and when the skids hit the lake bed at Rosamond, the airplane slammed down. And there were weak points in the bulkhead just behind the cockpit, and the airplane split and slid down the lake bed shaped like a banana and came to rest with the nose pointed up and the tail pointed down. With him in it, and as he said he didn't realize it until he got out and looked at it, that the airplane had split in half. But they discovered, and again, they fixed it and repaired it. There was an issue with the nose wheel shock absorber, which didn't work the way it was supposed to. So it was a tremendous G-load when the nose of the airplane hit the lake bed. But the fact that he got it back to Rosamond, they saved the airplane. And I might mention that was one of two, holy cow, you got to be kidding me, moments. Sorry. He survived another accident in testing the X-15 where the airplane wasn't even in the air. It was an engine test on a stand with the engine firing out onto the lake bed. And the guys were in a controlled concrete blockhouse a couple, 100 yards away. And he was throttling the XLR 99 engine. And there was a valve problem, and the thing just blew to kingdom come. It blew the cockpit of the airplane 35 feet forward off the test stand with him in it. He said it was like being inside the sun, is the way he described it. And here are all the rescue crews trying to get him out, and he's like, no, he said, I'm safer in the cockpit. Don't open the cockpit. But he survived that, and he was in probably shirt and tie. I mean, he wasn't wearing a flight suit. But he got through that, and he got through that lake bed landing and survived all the trials and tribulations of the X-15 program at that time. So thank you very much for the question. Yes, sir. Right. The question was, what do I know about the X-29, X-31? Any stories? Please forgive me. I don't mean to disappoint you. I'm not. I was involved at that time, but you know what? I'll spin this a different way. By that point in flight test research, routine is probably not the right word, but reliability and confidence. The routine aspect of taking a flight test airplane out and getting data and coming back was so different than the era we just covered. I know they lost the X-31 in a control system accident, but just a great testament to what flight test research had become by that era, that these airplanes would just routinely go up and push the envelope and return. And by that time, we were in the digital age. So I think that's a big part of it, too, to go from manual. I mean, you've got to remember, all these X-planes were designed with slide rules. And using a calculator was a huge advance, you know. But they were designed with lofting chalk and lofting lines and all. And then you get to the X-29, the digital age airplanes, and all the X-planes that we have today, which, by the way, are unmanned. So we have the X-50. People have said to me, oh, what do you think of the X-51? I go, well, that's a typo. You're talking about the X-15. You go, no, the X-51 Wave Rider, I think it is, where it's launched from a B-52, goes to Mach 10, right, out over the Pacific Ocean for 18 seconds or 30 seconds to get all the data, and then it crashes in the ocean. So my comment is, and I don't mean to, I just putting things in perspective, if I were to do a litho of that, who would sign it? And again, this is not a slight to flight test engineering or any of the digital age personnel. I'm just saying that it's a different way of achieving data. And so the performance is outstanding, but again, there's no risk to a pilot. And as I say, these airplanes succeed routinely. And so to your question, that era points to how far we came from the era that I just talked about. So thank you. The question was, have I had the experience of working with Tony LaVere? And yes, I was privileged to work with LaVere on a mural that I painted at Burbank Airport in tribute to the P-38. And he, at that time, was the president of the P-38 Association. Listening to his stories, and I remember one time I went up to visit him at Lockheed, and he was sitting at his desk wearing coveralls, and he was eating his lunch out of a black World War II lunchbox. Had the thermos in the top and everything. And I remember coming up and, hey, Tony, how you doing? Hey, you want a sandwich? It's like, you're Tony LaVere. What do you? I mean, it was just incredible. And he would tell wonderful, wonderful stories. But here's an interesting comment on LaVere. I asked this of all the pilots. This is my favorite question. What's your favorite airplane of everything you've flown? What's your favorite? And it's always, without hesitation, Joe Engel, X-15, Pete Everest, F-86. I mean, it's just, boom, they know. So I said to LaVere, what's the think about this, first flight of the U-2, first flight of the P-80, bailed out of umpteen, he's done it all. And I said, what's the favorite airplane of all the stuff you've done, F-104, what's the favorite airplane in your career? And he looks at me and he says, the T-33, subsonic trainer, shooting star. And I said, that's it? Of all the airplanes you've flown? He goes, yeah, because that's the airplane that gave the world jet pilots. That's Tony LaVere. Thank you for the question. The question was, what did I have to do to become an aviation artist? Ingredient number one, love airplanes. I had 5 years of art school, started at Pratt Institute in New York and graduated Cal State Long Beach out of their illustration program. Worked for Douglas in the art department. It was just a case of just being in love with the idea of creating two-dimensional imagery of a three-dimensional object and making it look real. I've been flying airplanes since I was 16, and that's a big ingredient in aviation art, because to experience pulling G's in a fighter and being inverted and aerobatics and everything else, you bring that into the artwork. So it's a fusion of the love of flying, the knowledge of the airplanes, and the art training to make it look as believable as possible. So that's the objective. Thank you for the question. The gentleman made the point that the X-15 was the first research program to have a simulator where pilots could prepare for the flights. The X-2 had what they call the Iron Cross, a very primitive version of that. The X-1 did not. And so the X-15 allowed the pilots to really prepare in a very detailed, comprehensive way for each flight that they were going to do. And as I should mention, the 199 flights were one step at a time. Anything in flight test is one little step at a time. So they do Mach 1.2 and 1.4, 1.6, and that was the progression. Later in the X-15 program, they were doing a lot of testing of ballistic missile guidance systems and stellar sighting systems and things like that, using the airplane as a test bed. But as a perfect point is that they had a simulator, and it was becoming a much more advanced technology to get an airplane into lower space. So thank you. Why did the XB-70 get built? Anybody here heard of Curtis LeMay? He's the Air Force Chief of Staff and father of the Strategic Air Command. And in the Cold War, the belief was that, as we just covered here, bigger and faster was better. And so we went from the B-52, B-47, 6-jet bomber to the 8-jet B-58, the Mach 2, the B-52 Stratofortress, the Mach 2 B-58, and then the next step was going to be a Mach 3 6-engine delta wing monster bomber that would deal with the Soviet threat and take the capability of nuclear attack to a whole new dimension. And then they realized that it was a very complicated airplane. They didn't really, to have fleets of these things on the ramps at SAC bases it became unfeasible. And so they wound up building 2 prototypes. And those were used for testing supersonic transport, shockwave propagation and technology. As I said, one was lost in an accident, the other survived. But the purpose of the B-70 was to be the ultimate strategic bomber, and they realized they had gone literally too far. I think it's ironic that the B-52, of all those airplanes I just mentioned, still soldiers on today. Okay, 800 were built. There are now, I believe, 60 still operational, the B-52H model. And they just announced a refit program. They're going to re-engine the airplane with 8 small engines. And it is conceivable that this will be the first airplane in history to be operational for 100 years. First flight was 1952. Now they're talking about programs to extend the life. I should put in perspective, this is not the same airplane that first flew in 1952. The airplane has been upgraded, cockpit's been upgraded, all sorts of advanced systems, advanced weaponry, internal and external. But they cannot, it's like the DC-3, it's the airplane that wouldn't die. There's nothing else to replace it. And so, as I said, with all this technology and everything we've done, a subsonic 8-engine bomber is still the core of the strategic capability of the United States Air Force. Thank you for the question. Okay, well listen, I think I'm going to wrap it up. I thank you very much for attending. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Seniors Out and About. I'm Betty Wheaton. See you next time.